Hey guys, Robman here. Today I figured I would start off with a port review of the Japanese Tier 10 super cruiser, the Yoshino, and to a lesser extent the Tier 9 cruiser, the Azuma. I'm going to highlight the differences between the two ships. Long story short, they are both extremely good, and I'll be going over them in the port today. I will also be releasing a separate video with gameplay footage of the Yoshino, just in an effort to cut down on the overall length of each individual video. So with that said, to begin, I'll start out with the armor layouts of both ships. They're very similar. The Yoshino, 25mm bow and stern, 40mm bottom. The midships, all of the armor, deck and sides included, is 30mm with a 16mm superstructure. This is mostly standard. The armor is very similar to the Tier 10 cruiser Zhao. The stern is the same 25mm plus a small aft and armor belt of about 175 going down to 120 beneath the waterline to protect the steering gear. The citadel on this ship is quite large, but it is rather narrow. You can see it from the front. It does extend well above the waterline, about that far, but you can see that above that, for what good it does, it has a very, very shallow turtleback. So plunging fire from short range tends to be pretty well protected against if they aim high. If they aim low, it will likely citadel. Plunging fire from a further distance will tend to go through that. Even at 125mm, especially as you start to get further out as the shells start to approach here or here, the armor of this ship does not hold up particularly well if you show broadside. In terms of the flat broadside armor, if you angle properly, as I said, 30mm on the outside, and the actual citadel armor on the sides gets progressively worse as you head underwater, but the top portion is not terrible at 178mm, with a decent athwart ship of 195mm at the top, and about 100mm towards the bottom underneath the waterline. As I said before, because the bow is completely overmatchable by anything with 15-inch guns or larger, this is definitely not a ship that you want to be tanking in. The armor on this ship is essentially identical to the Azuma, with the notable exception that the Azuma only has a 27mm center section. So what that means is that any gun 16-inch, that's 406mm or larger, will easily be able to overmatch even the center part of the ship. Whereas with the 30mm, you would need something like a Republique at a minimum with 431mm guns to go through it effectively. I will note that the turret armor on both ships is identical, 305mm on the face, 210 on the barbettes, and it ranges from a high of 152 to 127 on the turret sides, as well as a 100mm roof. I don't find the turrets getting knocked out very often, but that might be down to the specific build that I run on these ships. I'll go over that towards the end of the port review. But it should be noted that the turret armor is rather flat from all directions, so if you do not run the module to reduce the likelihood of them being knocked out, they do tend to get whacked fairly often. Beyond that, being super cruisers, they both have a decent chunk of hit points. We can see here on the Azuma, 58,350 health. That is very good for a Tier 9 cruiser. And the Yoshino tops that up to 61.8 thousand health. Very, very good, even for a Tier 10 cruiser. Not quite as much as something like a Moskva or a Stalingrad, but still a good chunk of health, and they do come with a heal as well. A 22% torpedo damage reduction is not ideal given the length of the ship and the maneuverability, but it's acceptable. It does the job. In terms of artillery, they both have the same 310mm guns. In the case of the Yoshino and the build that I have, they have a 16.3 second reload. This is with the reload mod. Without the reload mod, which I run on the Yoshino B, this has the range mod. They reload in 18.5 seconds. You can see that base, they also have a 36-second 180-degree turn time, which is very good, and a decent dispersion. The high explosive shell with that reload is fantastic for fire starting, with a fire chance of 27% and 52mm armor penetration. So what that means is you can sling these shells just like you would in a Hindenburg, and they will pen many of the decks and side armors in the game. The armor piercing shell is also more than adequate. You can see standard, it does just over 8,500 damage, which is fantastic. The secondary armament is your standard Akazuki 100mm guns. They're really not very good. Building for secondaries on these ships is definitely not recommended, but they are good as an anti-aircraft gun, which I will go over in a bit. You can see with the range mod, the range does go up to almost 25 kilometers. Without the mod, the stock range is about 21, which is more than usable, considering the ship also has a spotter plane. Now, the notable difference between the Yoshino and the Azuma, the Yoshino has torpedoes. I run the 20-kilometer ones. I don't find them to be particularly useful. They do have forward-firing arcs, but they're not particularly good. You can't fire torpedoes like this. You're generally only going to be able to get them off at approximately this angle. So I tend to use them at a longer range, usually for cap control or cap contesting. If you need to YOLO somebody, they do work well for that, as expected. The Azuma, as I mentioned, does not have these torpedoes. In terms of an airstrike, they both have the standard Japanese airstrike with 2 attack flights. The AA defense is slightly different. The Yoshino has these 40mm double mounts, so it does have a slightly higher anti-aircraft rating than the Azuma, which has the standard terrible 25mm mounts, which look like these, except with the triples. That said, neither of the AA defenses is amazing, not by a long shot, and on both ships I choose to run hydroacoustic as opposed to defensive AA because you're not going to be able to stop a strike no matter what, especially given the size of these ships. These ships, it should be noted, are very, very vulnerable to both torpedo bombers and the new skip bombers with the Russian carriers, simply because of the thin exterior armor. Beyond that, the maneuverability, both of these ships are pretty fast. I run the speed flag on both, and they go about 36 knots. The turning circle radius, pretty terrible at 920 meters. They do not turn very quickly, and they have very close to a battleship rudder shift time of 14 seconds. The concealment, however, on my standard Yoshino, I do run a concealment build, and it gets down to just a hair under 12 kilometers detectability range by sea. Without the concealment build, that bumps up to closer to 14.7 kilometers, closer to 15 kilometers. Depending on what kind of build you want to run on these ships, there's plenty of options in terms of that. The Azuma, as expected, I also run the concealment expert on this build as well. We can see that the concealment is roughly identical, and the maneuverability is very similar, with the exception that the rudder shift time is actually slightly lower. I believe that is actually down to the build that I run on this ship. Yes, I run the steering gears mod on this ship. I choose not to run it on the Yoshino, opting instead for the propulsion modification. I haven't decided which one is better. It entirely depends on your individual play style. I find both to be equally good. I don't find that I'm needing the survivability expert module, just because although this is a super cruiser, I do find that because it is a backline ship, you don't tend to take that many torpedoes or that many fires without the damage control party being available. With that said, I'll briefly go over a couple of the builds that I have for these ships. As I said, on my commander I do run the concealment module, but I only run the I should say I run the concealment skill on the commander. On the ship, I only run the module on the Yoshino. On the Yoshino B, I choose to play that a little bit differently, just so it has a slightly different playstyle. In terms of equipment on the standard Yoshino, I have main armaments mod 1 to prevent the main turrets, which are very flat, from getting knocked out constantly. I don't find the engine or the steering gear getting knocked out on account of the armor around the steering gear and the fact that this is a large cruiser, so the engine is reasonably well protected as long as you're not eating a torpedo salvo or taking an inordinate number of citadels. So I choose to run the damage control systems mod 1 just to reduce the chance of me getting set on fire from the long-range HE salvos that are so common nowadays. Because this is a long-range ship, I run aiming systems mod 1 to get that dispersion down. Propulsion mod 1, there is an option here. Either steering gears or propulsion mod, either of them can be excellent on this ship. It is completely up to you which one you choose to run. I don't find Damcon mod 2 to be necessary. It is also an option, though. In terms of this slot, I don't find the torpedo lookout system to be useful on this ship just because I tend to play it at a longer range. The concealment system mod 1, if you're running a concealment build, is good. Or, if you choose to run a maneuverability build, the steering gears mod 2 in combination with the steering gears module in this slot, you can really get the maneuverability of this ship to a decent state. which means that when you are maneuvering at long range, particularly with the 30mm center armor on this ship, things like a Montana or those types of battleships that can't overmatch the center of your ship find it very, very difficult to land hits or damage the ship at long range. Beyond that, as I said, I also run the main battery reload booster at the expense of a little bit of turret traverse. You can run that, or you can run the range mod. Both of them are effective. The guns do have a high enough velocity to be effective at 25 kilometers. I do find myself firing a majority high explosive, although the AP is more than good on these ships. 12-inch AP is definitely nothing to sneeze at. I don't find it worth it to run the torpedo tubes mod, just because, as I said before, the torpedo tubes are definitely a proactive weapon. They are not something that you're going to be able to use regularly to react to threats appearing on your flanks. Beyond that, in terms of my commander build, you can see I do run Yamamoto on this ship, so I run Grease the Gears just to get the turret traverse back down to help offset the cost of having the reload module. I do have a few torpedo skills to get the speed and the damage up, because these are IJN torpedoes. You can see they do approximately, with this build, 24,000 damage, which is extremely good, along with a 65 knot top speed, which you need because you can see the detectability is absolutely terrible at 2.5 kilometers. These torpedoes, you really do want to fire them at long range and kind of pray that the enemy is not paying attention. You want to aim for the larger battleships, Yamatos, Vermonts, the types of battleships that like to sit in the back and drive in a straight line. Those are the things you're going to want to aim for. Beyond that, because I do fire mostly HE in this ship, Demolition Expert is obligatory, just to get the fire chance up. I also run Superintendent for extra heals, Adrenaline Rush, Radio Location, and Concealment Expert. Now, Radio Location is not strictly necessary. I run it just so I don't get snuck up on with a DD. This ship is not particularly good at dealing with destroyers unless you anticipate them coming. The high explosive, because you generally have it loaded, does extreme damage. It is not uncommon to hit for 6,000 or more damage in your opening salvo on a destroyer, even at medium range. But in order to do that, you need to not let them sneak up on you. It is an option to run Outnumbered on this ship, simply because the main battery firing range is large enough where if you sit off to one flank, it is fairly common that you can put yourself in a position to be able to have more enemy ships within your range than friendlies. But I find that this ship performs better when you do have allies around to take the fire, because as I said before, the armor on this ship is not particularly strong. And particularly when you have battleships with large 18-inch guns, anything Republic and larger, so Kremlins, Vermonts, the armor just doesn't hold up. Essentially, the entirety of your ship can be overmatched by them. So with that said, that is my review and build of the Yoshino. I will have a gameplay example put up on the channel, hopefully later today, if not tomorrow. Thank you, and Robman out.